Brother Mike, would you lead us in prayer after our song?
We're going to sing verses 1, 3, and 5. 1, 3, and 5.
Amen. All right. You know, of course, the story of Joseph, who was, well, let me back up a little bit. His father was in love with a woman, and he wanted to marry her. The problem was that she wasn't the oldest daughter, and the custom was that the oldest daughter had to get married before the next ones could, and so the future father-in-law of Joseph dressed his oldest daughter up with a veil so that she couldn't be seen, which was again a part of their custom, what they did. And so apparently she didn't say anything during the ceremony or during their wedding night, and the next morning he wakes up and finds out he's married to the older sister of the woman he loved. So he makes the deal with his father-in-law makes a deal with him for the second daughter, and then he has children with both wives, and the wife he loved did not have children for a long time, and she finally has a boy, and he is the favorite, and his name is Joseph. And I know there are a lot of questions about all that part of the story, about what God approved of and didn't approve of, but anyway, this boy is named Joseph. And because he was apparently favored by his father, everybody knew it. His older brothers knew it. Apparently he knew it too, and maybe was a little obnoxious about it. Kind of read between the lines. We don't know exactly what all the deal was, but Eventually, we know that he was sold into slavery by his brothers, and he ended up in Egypt, where he became number two, just behind Pharaoh in authority. And when his family was hungry, they moved to, or went to Egypt to try to buy food, and you know the exchange there ended up the entire family came to Egypt. After which, over a period of time, they began to really prosper, and they were given what's referred to as the land of Goshen, which I've never understood that because it's the fertile valley. And maybe it flooded once in a while. I don't know why Egypt let them have that place, but they did well with their crops and with their stock. And it says in the very end of Genesis, the last verse, so Joseph died at the age of 110. After they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. He made them promise, take me back home and bury me. Don't ask me why. I guess he just wanted to. I think of the days when our country was expanding into the West, when somebody died, you buried them right there where they were. And I used to say, when I die, just bury me on the side of the road and keep going. In fact, I don't even care whether you bury me or not. Just don't roll me over in the ditch. But nevertheless, this was a big thing for them, and it did eventually happen. They took him back. But now we're into Exodus. And this is a new not only a new book, it's a new phase. Because what happened after a period of time? Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing. We've talked about this in terms of our own culture and our own situation. A Pharaoh came up who didn't what? Yeah. And what had Joseph done?
He's the one that basically saved the people.
Yeah, he saved Egypt. He saved not just his people, but he saved the whole nation of Egypt because of the prophecy about there's going to be 7 years of prosperity and then 7 years of famine. And so we're going to save up, we're going to stockpile, we're going to be hoarders, we're going to save enough food so that we can get through. Of course, it also made the government even richer, but what they do, they made them, you got to give me your crops, and then when it came time, they had to buy it back from the government. So the government came out slicker than grease on that deal, the way they worked it. But nevertheless, a Pharaoh came up, and it'd be like we having a president today who didn't remember some important person in our history who had, saved our country or something like that. Yes, sir. Yeah. 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 And sometimes we see a little bit of that maybe going on today where people are trying to forget some particular people for something they may have done, good or bad. Even the best among us have problems, right? And sometimes we do things that have extended consequences that we didn't know anything about. For instance, most recently, we just had Columbus Day. There are some people who hate Columbus. And, when Columbus was coming here, what was he looking for when he discovered the New World?
I can't remember, but it seems to me he was looking for a different route to someplace.
Yeah, he was trying to find a safer route to India so they wouldn't have to go by the Islamic countries where all the pirates were in Africa. So they would go that route and they would be attacked. So, hey, you know what? If we could find another way, let's go around the back door. And instead, the world was bigger than he thought it was, and he ran into a whole new continent. And he wasn't coming here to, quote unquote, do bad things to North America, as some people would try to credit him with today. So, nevertheless, here's Exodus chapter 1. And these people were eventually began to be oppressed. Why?
Because they were slaves.
Saying what?
They were free to work.
Yeah, true. Eventually. But look a little about verse 7 and 8 down in there. 9, 10.
They're outnumbering Egypt.
At least, if not outnumbering, getting to be a big enough number to cause a problem.
They became a political problem
Yeah.
because they weren't Egyptian. If you go back over into Genesis, one of the reasons that God planned the ocean is because the Egyptians didn't like herders. They detested people who took care of herding.
Mm-hmm.
So when Joseph met with Pharaoh, he said, hey, you just give us this outlying area over Goshen, which happened to become the best grazing land in Egypt. And now they're regretting doing that because they prospered so well.
Yeah, and they have reached a number, apparently from what we're reading from the text here, of about 600,000 men. And, you know, you have that much of an influx. And the fear is if we are invaded, and you got to remember, in the ancient world, every king or ruler of every nation basically wanted to expand his territory. How do you do that? You start a war, yeah, and you conquer somebody else. And what's the fear? If some enemy comes in here, likely from Greece, although they may have a Greek background themselves, but if some enemy comes in here, what do we fear the Israelites will do? They'll work with the enemy. That's the fear. And so we'll have, you know, they know our land, they know our weak parts, they can be subversive, they can be spies. So we got to control this now. So rather than just run them off, they enslaved them. Up to this point, they'd basically been a free people. Apparently. I mean, I'm not saying they were equal to the Egyptians. They were not. Like if you've read my bulletin article, even Rome was a republic for its citizens. But if you weren't a citizen, you were under a dictatorship. You know, if you were a Roman citizen, okay. But if you weren't a Roman citizen, then you had problems. Well, basically the same thing would be with the Jews here, the Israelites here in Egypt. They're not Egyptian citizens, so they don't have the same rights, even though up to this point they've been basically free to work and grow and etc. All right, anyone else want to share anything?
Well, wasn't the Pharaoh conquered by the Hyksos because they had horses and chariots to go to war with? And so that's the reason, and the Egyptians, Jewish people were occupying the most productive land in Egypt. And so that's the reason that they were enslaved and the land was taken so the Hyksos could farm the land and get that, it was a Nile delta that they were living in. And the delta is where, the soil comes
Yeah.
from the Nile, and it had expanded and grown, and it was the most productive because they had brought, the Nile had continually brought
Right.
the topsoil from, Ethiopia.
Well, and even further back, yes, the snow would melt on the mountains, run down the Nile, and would bring the topsoil and nutrients as well. So yes, but again, you know, we see some of this attitude and action today, like look what Russia's doing to Ukraine. Why are they doing that? Yeah, but not just the territory. They want whatever the resources. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. They want the resources that are in Ukraine. It's like if let's say Mexico attacked us in the U.S. because they wanted the oil that was in Texas. I'm not sure we're the most oil-rich state, but nevertheless, let's say if they wanted that, then that's what they would come for. They wouldn't come for Texas. They wouldn't come for the land. They would want the resources that are here. So that's what happens in this ancient world. That's the way they did. I'm not saying there wasn't some ego involved in it. You remember what they said about Alexander the Great at the age of 25? He did what? He cried because there wasn't anything else for him to conquer. He had conquered the known world for him. And like, oh, what do I do now? You know, I had this goal I wanted to do by the time I was 60, and I'm 25, I've already reached it, so boo-hoo, poor me. Well, again, there's ego involved in it, there's the desire for resources, there's power, all sorts of things are involved. And so this Pharaoh is saying, we got to make sure our defenses are ready. And people in power frequently operate off of fear, whatever it is. You know, we operate off of fear. And even if we're not in power, sometimes we operate off of fear, even if we don't realize it. I was talking today because Mark had got a good bargain on something. And anyhow, I mentioned that in the 70s, in the late 1970s, Johnny Carson, the late night talk show guy, made a stupid joke about toilet paper. The next day, the grocery store shelves were cleaned out because they took him serious. That we're going to run out. And what he said was like, next thing you know, we're going to run out of toilet paper or something like that. And so everybody's panicking. What am I going to do without toilet paper? And so where did that come from? They're just a little fear thing that clicks in our mind. So anyway. Yeah, oh yeah. Unreal. All right, let's go to our question page for just a minute. Why would the Israelites have prospered and multiplied? We've touched on it already, but let's just get it. Yeah, they gave them the fruitful land, the fertile land, and the crops did well, their animals did well. And God blessed them most of all. Right. And it is interesting how sometimes what we think is worthless is really the most valuable. You know, when they struck oil, what did they do with that oil when they first struck it? When they first found it up in Pennsylvania, what did they do with that oil? They refined it for what? You don't remember? You were just a kid at the time, right? Kerosene. They wanted kerosene for their lamps to replace killing the whales and using the whale oil for lamps. We want kerosene. What did they do with gasoline? They threw it away. It was a byproduct. It was worthless.
That's what they used to do when they made gasoline. The byproduct of gasoline is diesel. At one time, it was just a waste product.
Yeah. So here we are. We've thrown them out on this no good land that we don't want, and yet God saw to it that it worked in the favor of Israel, and they were blessed. Discuss the reason for the new Pharaoh to make slaves. We talked about that. Anybody want to add anything to it? Yeah. out of fear. Yeah, keep them under control, keep them subdued. Make sure they don't join up with our enemies. All right, describe the kind of women who were midwives.
Not trying to make money, but somebody doesn't charge as much as a doctor. Basically, they were honest and faithful women who were in quite intelligent. Knew how to get around Pharaoh's directives.
Yeah, they figured that out. You know, I would imagine that for the most part, they were women who had already had a child or two. But maybe not. But they have been trained or schooled. You know, even here in our country, 150 years ago, you went to medical school, you didn't learn very much. And what did you typically do then? You went and worked with another doctor where you learned the real stuff. And if you go back far enough, that's how you learned to become a doctor. You went and worked with another doctor. And he taught you what he had learned, some of which would have been good, some of which would have been stupid. And in our concept, you know, like the blood leaching, or you know, they used to drain your blood or use leeches and suck the blood out of you because they thought your blood was bad, and so we get rid of the bad blood. Wow. Yeah. Yeah, and that's. Did they have children or did they not have children? It's I've toyed with that myself. Yeah, but if maybe they didn't have enough, anyway, he gave them more, or gave them their first. We don't know, but nevertheless, they're the women that you called when you said, "I'm in labor," because they knew what to do and how to handle that. And what was it? I read one time years ago. You know, in the movies, they always told the father to go out and boil a big pot of water, and the comment under that was to get them out of the way. You know, because it's going to take a long time for a big pot of water to boil. So you go out there and leave me alone. We'll take care of delivering the baby in here, and your nervousness is bothering all the rest of us. But these are people that they knew what they were doing. They came and they helped the mother she was giving birth. All right, what did these midwives do? You mentioned that they were obviously godly women, and when Pharaoh gave the rule, what was his first thing? What was his first command he gave about the babies? Kill the boys. Kill the males. And when he came back and said, "You're not doing it," their answer was, yeah. And I like how they said, you know, they're not like Egyptian women. And you know that there are differences sometimes in cultures and how we expect and what we do. When I was young, if you went to the hospital for any reason, have your tonsils out, have a baby, you stayed 2 weeks. That was it. It's like if you went to the hospital, you're going to be there 2 weeks. Somewhere years ago, I read, it was a fictional article, but it was supposed to be based on fact. It says an Aborigine, that'd be Australia, an Aborigine family of a father, a wife, a kid, and a mother-in-law. They're walking somewhere, and his wife is pregnant, and they're walking somewhere out in the desert, and the pregnant woman goes into labor, and so she stops and sits under the shade of a bush or a tree, and the father, the mother-in-law, and the other kid just keep walking, and she sits there and stays under that shrub, and she has her baby, and then she picks it up and catches up with the rest of them. And the point he was making in that article about how it used to be was a difference in cultures and difference what we expect. So what the midwife said to Pharaoh may have had some truth to it. Because after all, what did these Jewish women do? They worked. And what did the Egyptian women do? Probably didn't work as hard. They may have worked some, but they didn't work like the Jewish women, because in our vernacular, they're the wives of farmers and ranchers. So, they're out there doing stuff. But nevertheless, he then gives us the order to, okay, then every newborn son, male, has got to be thrown into the River Nile, which has a little bit of play to it in that they worship the Nile. That was one of their gods. So throwing those babies into the Nile would be like a sacrifice to their god. Yeah. All right. What about Moses' mother? What do you think what she did? Yeah, she kept him for 3 months until he got, I guess, so loud she couldn't hide him anymore. I don't know. And she did not disobey Pharaoh. She put her son in the Nile. But she made a basket. We would say probably like a wicker basket. She took some things and wove it together and then coated it with heavy grease, tar, whatever, so that it wouldn't leak. And the way it reads to me, she put it among the reeds so that it wouldn't drift down the river, which I don't know how fast the river flows at different times of the season. Obviously it flows more when there's more of the snow drainage coming down. But nevertheless, she puts him there and leaves his older sister to watch him. Tell me the story. What happens?
I guess it was the Pharaoh's wife,
Daughter.
daughter found the baby, and the daughter asked her if she wanted a wet nurse, and she said, yeah, that sounds good. And so she went and got her mother, and her
Yeah.
mother basically raised Moses.
Yeah. And in the beginning, it would seem that she took him back home, because it doesn't say that the mother went with Pharaoh's daughter, that she actually just went back and had the baby there for her own. How long, we don't know exactly. In ancient times, it wasn't unusual at all to nurse a child for 2 years or even longer. So she had him for a long time. And then he, of course, goes to live in Pharaoh's palace. And it would seem that maybe the mother even came then and continued to do her nursing role as taking care of child care. Anyone else? Questions, comments, remarks? Question 5. Moses' mother. You think what she did was out of faith or out of fear? A little fear? Don't want to lose my son. And yet, maybe there was some faith in there too. I don't know. We're grasping at straws here, trying to read her mind. But I believe in any way that God was involved in it. Whether he planted the idea in her or, who knows. But obviously, and have we got to the question about his name? Oh, yeah. Give the meaning of his name. Moses. Yeah, apparently, check your footnotes. Some of them may say that it sounds like or similar to the Hebrew term for out of the water or drawn out of the water, something like that. So that means every time his name was used by his mother or his sister or brother or anybody else, what was he being reminded of? See,
That she had found him in the Nile.
all right, found him in the Nile.
Well, in answer to your question, the writer of Hebrews says that by faith, that Moses, his father and mother, did what they did because they didn't fear the edict of the king.
All right.
So, I would say that kind of qualifies the answer to that, if they did it by faith.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Anybody else? I'm just trying to think of a name that we might give someone that's a more common term. And just imagine that, well, I'll be extreme here. Just imagine your name was called by God to deliver Egypt or deliver Israel. Called by God or taken out of the water, saved from drowning. Every time they called your name, you were drawn out of the water, pulled out of the water. Be a constant reminder of your origin. And I strongly suspicion Moses heard the tale. I mean, haven't your family or friends told you things that happened when you were young, or maybe, something you did or something that was done to you, and you've heard that story over? I bet Moses knew that story about being drawn out of the water, and every time his name was called, he's reminded of it. Drawn out of that water for a purpose by God. Whether it always was in the forefront of his head anyway. Number 7, how long might Moses have lived with his mother before going to live in the palace? I touched on that already. Yeah, it could have been as long as 2 years. May have even been longer. I don't know. Maybe until he was potty trained. Who knows? But the point is that there did come a time when he was, we say about a dog, he's housebroken. There did come a time when he didn't need to be constantly watched. That's when our babies the most trouble. 2 times. When they're infants and when they're teenagers. So okay, they got him now in the infancy, got him through that period. All right, next question. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, in the early years, I don't know that we can tell. We're doing a lot of assuming here. Obviously, she needed someone to nurse the child. And I suspicion that Moses' mother did become a nanny and go into the palace with him, because somehow or another, he knew who he was. He knew he was a Hebrew. And I don't know that that would necessarily be something that Pharaoh's daughter would be constantly reminding him of. A few years ago, when a child was adopted, the parents would be told, don't tell them. Don't tell them you're adopted. And many times kids would find out, and then they were either angry or elated, depending on the situation. And now I think they've switched to the opposite. You tell them from the very beginning, you're adopted, you're adopted, you're adopted. But how long was he with his mother? I would say long enough that he could comprehend what his mother was telling him, and who his people were, what his origins were. Why did I get this funny name and a whole bunch of other stuff? All right, number 8. Consider the advantages given to Moses for living in Pharaoh's house. Education. 2 of you right in a row. That's right. He wasn't a slave. Yeah, he didn't have to do that kind of work. He wasn't a slave. And he was, Greg says that in Kenya, it's an ignorant Kenyan that doesn't know 5 languages. So They may not be able to read them all, but they know Swahili and English because those are national languages that are taught in school. And then there's tribal languages. You know your grandmother's tribal language and your other grandmother's tribal language, or something like that. So you know all these languages. So to say that he had the advantage of education is not to say that everybody else is ignorant. It's to say that he had the refined education. Yeah, homeschool, private school. But he was taught elevated above. He also had connections. I mean, after all, he's an adopted son of Pharaoh, or grandson. So he knows Yul Brynner. All right. He also ate well, dressed well. Question 9. Why would Moses come to the aid and defense of the Hebrew slave? Yeah. It wasn't like that's somebody I don't know. That's a conquered villain, That's a prisoner of war. No. That's my people. And how did Moses go about it? What does he say he did?
So he killed him.
Yeah, but back up a half step. Before he did that, what did he do? He looked around. What would a prosecuting attorney say today? That's premeditated. Yeah. And this guy he killed is an Egyptian. Now he's a guard, and I don't know how Moses did it, whether he shot him with a Glock 45 or what he did, but he killed him. Doesn't like it anyway. So then he looked, nobody's around to see it. He rescues the man. The next day he sees the man he rescued. Is that right? No, he sees 2 other men. And he stops the bully, who's of the 2 Jewish men. He stops the Jewish bully. And what does the Jewish bully say back to Moses?
What are you going to do? Kill us like you did the guard?
Yeah, so here's 2 strangers they didn't see that, but they've already heard the story. Which means that probably most of the Jews, or the Israelites, they weren't called Jews at this time, but most of the Israelites knew the story by now. And so Moses thought it's going to get around. Yeah, in my youth, I remember seeing a sign having to do with the World War II secrets. It said, if one person knows something, it's a secret. If 2 people know it, and they had 2 ones, if 2 people know it, then 11 people know it. And if you tell someone else, then they're going to, because everybody's got somebody they have to tell. I promise you won't repeat this, but let me tell you this secret. Yeah, and so all of a sudden, Moses is terrified because he knows the word's going to get back to Pharaoh. All right, so Moses takes off. Who does he meet? How does he meet him? Yeah, he knows Pharaoh's going to get him. So I better get out of Dodge. And he travels to this distant place, another country. What are the one things we need? We don't recognize it as much today because it's so plentiful for us. But if you're traveling out in a primitive environment, what's one of the things you need every day and a lot of it? Water. Yeah. So a watering hole or an oasis or a well is very important. So he comes to a place where he can get some water. And what did he find? What's the scene? And what's the problem? I'm sorry, first part. Yeah, it's like two flocks arrive at the same time. One of them shepherded by women, the other one shepherded by men. Well, who's going to win this fight? So the men come in using their superior strength, maybe even superior numbers, and they drive the women back, drive the flock back, say, we're first. You were here first, but we're going to be first now. Whatever. And Moses comes in and stands up to these men. Yeah, to the men, for the women, to the men. And I don't know, was there just one shepherd? My thinking is there was more than one. So here's Moses. Was there something impressive about him? Was he still wearing priestly garments? Was he taller or whatever? Or did he was educated, so maybe it was his bearing that they thought, wow, this is somebody important. But he defends the women, stands up to the men, says, you guys back off. And he lets the women water their flock. His dress and his dialect, you and I can go to another country that speaks English and we immediately stand out because of our dialect. Or sometimes even here in the States, you go to another state and someone says, you're not around from here, are you? You're not from around here, are you? No, I'm not, I'm from here or there, whatever. But anyhow, he's recognized as being an Egyptian. Say?
Got a Texas accent.
May have a Texas accent, yeah. So, his demeanor, his language, his dress, his confidence. If he's come from Pharaoh's house, he's probably used to giving orders. He's like a top sergeant or general. He says something, you do it. And that's the way he talks to these guys, with confidence. So all of this allows him to not necessarily get in a physical fight, but he does defend them. All right. And then what happened? The women go and tell who? Yeah, Daddy looks up and he says, hey, you guys are home early. What happened? You don't usually get home till 5 o'clock, and here it is 3 in the afternoon. What happened? They tell the story, and he says, and you didn't even invite him to dinner? What's going on with you guys? So apparently, close enough that they were able to get back to him and invite him and come. And of course, we know that as a result of that, Moses marries one of the daughters. And what's this man, this father and now father-in-law, what's his name? Say again? What translation are you reading from? Anybody else have a different translation? Yeah, that's what I had, and I was.
Well, mine says.
Oh, you're talking about Reuel, verse 18. Return to Reuel, their father. Y'all remember Reuel Lemons? Used to be the editor of the Firm Foundation. That's where his name came from. All right, and well, yeah, Jethro. I'm looking for the Jethro now. Mike, where is it? Chapter 3. So whether we call him Reuel or whether we call him Jethro, but as the name of Jethro, he is also called a what? Yeah. Now, he's a priest. That's got to be a priest of God, of Yahweh. And I think this is again evidence in support of the fact that it wasn't only the Jews who worshiped Yahweh God. There were other people. Yes, God chose Abraham and his descendants to be the people of Israel to bring forth the Messiah, but that doesn't mean they were the only ones who were saved or the only ones who were in a good relationship with God, that they're the only ones who worship God. We have another character that pops up later or early on with who was it that Abraham offered sacrifices through in Salem, Jerusalem? Melchizedek. He was a priest. So neither Abraham nor Moses would be offering sacrifices through the priest of a false god. So to me, and I guess part of what I'm going back to is it serves so easy as an illustration. I've heard preachers use it in the past to talk about that Israel was like the forerunner of the church, and if you were an Israelite, you were saved, and if you weren't, you were lost. And you know they use the whole thing here about being in Egypt was like being in sin. You crossed the Jordan, the Red Sea, and then you wandered in the wilderness, and the Red Sea represented baptism. Wilderness represented your life, and then when you crossed the Jordan River, that was death, and you went into the Promised Land. And there was a brother in my congregation when I was growing up. He was the father of one of my friends, and when he prayed, you said this before, he always talked about crossing the chilly river of death, the cold, wet, cold river of death. He was talking about crossing the Jordan. And we even have songs that we sing about crossing the Jordan as being an image of death. But in that story or illustration or example, if you care to call it, if not outright stated, at least the implied thing is there weren't any other saved people except the Israelites. And I'm telling you, that's just not true. That's just not true. Anybody else?
Well, Numbers 10:29, we named the guy again, Reuel, whatever it says again.
Rule.
3:1 says chapter.
All right, 8, 9, 10. Where are we? Okay. Moses is out doing his thing, and all of a sudden he sees a burning bush. Now, as I've said before, this is a desert area. They get some rain like we do. But have you ever seen a tumbleweed burn? Yeah, it's just like a candle rocket. Boom, rocket.
He goes to investigate it, and he hears God say that this is sacred land.
Yeah. And I don't get the connection of taking your sandals off because the ground is holy or sacred. But
Whether your shoes were considered an insult.
yeah.
Throw your shoe at somebody, that's an insult.
I don't know how long some things, throwing a shoe at someone. But see, again, we're talking about traditions that are maybe centuries later. We know today in the Middle East, if you show the sole of your foot, if you cross your legs and that's an insult. What it was back then, was it still true then? Or what did it begin then? I don't know. But bare feet on the ground because you're in the presence of God may have meant much more to Moses than it would have meant to me or to you. I would have probably said there's goat heads here. There's cactus. But anyway, and then tell me about the miracles that were performed right there on Moses for him to convince him. Tell me what they were. Bush didn't burn. What did he have in his hand? Staff. God says throw it down. He does. Turns into a snake, which he's going to repeat in Pharaoh's palace later on. But he throws it down, turns into a snake, and he runs because he's afraid of copperheads. whatever it is. And then God says, what? Go pick it up by the tail. And he does, and it turns back into a stick. Moses is still not convinced. And my assumption is this bush is still burning. And so God says, do what with your hand?
Oh, stick it inside.
Yeah, they didn't have buttons. They wrapped their garments around them and tied them with a sash. So just stick it inside your shirt.
Pull it out, you've got leprosy.
Yeah, and his hand is white. And if you got a footnote, it'll tell you that the term leprosy is used to cover a multitude of different skin diseases. So it doesn't really matter what it is. It's the fact that he pulls his hand out and it's covered in boils or sores or white or whatever it is, at which point I think most of us would rightly be scared out of our mind. You know, what's happened to my hand? And God says, don't panic, put it back in. He does, and it's healed. And then what does Moses do? He argues with God. What are the arguments he gives?
Oh, that he wasn't, have a good enough voice that he couldn't speak to Moses, to Pharaoh.
Yeah. You know, what was wrong with his voice? I don't know. Did he stammer? Did he whatever? He just maybe just has stage fright. You know, I've mentioned before, I don't understand this exactly, but the number one fear of most people is public speaking. Number two fear is death. They fear standing up in front of a group and talking more than they fear dying. It's kind of strange, but I mean, it doesn't have to be a big group either. I mean, you go to a dinner and there's 6 people there and you ask them to stand up and say something, they can't do it. They just literally are terrified. They go into panic mode. There's some people that are like that. Moses says, I can't speak. So God says, never mind, I'll help you. And then he says, well, I'm still not good at it. Could you get somebody else? And God says, okay. Who? Aaron. Your big brother Aaron. So, how old is Moses at this time? He's 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness. He's 80 years old. And he's just now being called by God to do a great work. Say again?
It's all God's timing.
God's timing. All right, 15:16. Describe Moses' personal situation at this time. Explain the actions described in verses 21-22 of chapter 3. Moses has got a wife. He's got kids. He's 80 years old.
And one of the most highly educated men in the world.
Yeah. What's said in 21-22?
That's where he tells the women to go around and collect gold and silver.
Yeah. This is God directing, or he's telling Moses, but this is God telling the women and all, you go around and you collect valuables. When, say again? Yeah, that's God telling Moses this is what's going to happen. Yeah. When I was a young man, young boy, there was a religious group that would come by my dad's service station every year. I forgot what the date was, but there was a particular date. And I was curious about what was happening. They would come in the name of their church, which was I'm not sure what the name of it was, Church of God, Assembly of God, some type of charismatic Pentecostal type group. But they would come around every year and ask for donations for their church. Well, I didn't realize it then, but I learned later that they called it the fleecing of Egypt. In other words, they were going around begging for money for their church, and most American businessmen want to have good relationships with their community. So when you come by asking for money for a charity, whatever that charity might be, the tendency is for the business owner, a small business owner, not a corporate necessarily or a franchise, but the guy who owns the local shop will give money because he wants you to come and buy his product or his service. And yet the people who were collecting the money felt like they were taking money from the enslavers. They called it the fleecing of Egypt. So that's a situation where people have taken a situation that happened in the biblical, and they're using that as an example of how they're supposed to treat the rest of the world. Anyway. All right, were there any other signs that God used to convince Moses? But one thing, he takes all these miracles and he goes back to Aaron. Aaron meets him on the way back. And Moses does what? He does some of the same miracles. Apparently he throws his rod down and it turns into a serpent. And Aaron gets to see this stuff, which convinces Aaron that, hey, this guy's really got God with him. So he's excited about that, as I think we all would be. Look at chapter 4, verse 24-27. What do you see there? Yeah. After everything that Moses has been through, all the miracles that God done to him, the miracles that he's performed in front of others, Aaron and others, he's still crawfishing. He's still backing out. He's still checking. He still doesn't want to do it. And God's getting a little perturbed with him at this point. Which kind of gives me a little bit of hope for me and others that, you may be struggling. You may think that I can't do it. Yeah. Stay with your promise, stay with your pledge, stay with your calling, stay with your God. All right, so what happened when Moses returned to his people? First of all, he goes to Pharaoh. And what does he tell Pharaoh? Exactly what God told him to tell him, which is, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, you got too much time on your hands. The only reason you're complaining is because you got time to sit around and talk about it. So from now on, we're going to make you make brick without straw. Straw was part of the binding ingredient in the clay, I guess. And you're going to have to gather your own straw. We're going to quit providing it for you. So that, I won't say doubled, but it increased their workload. And they said, okay, but we're not expecting any less brick. You were making 10,000 a day. We still want 10,000. So they were pressured. And when it all boiled down to it, I'll keep on. Israel wasn't happy because, and you just come back and made all this palaver, all this talk, made all these promises, and yet instead of our life becoming easier, it has what? Become worse. Yeah. And they seem to be a murmuring, complaining people, but I don't want to blame that on the Israelites. I want to blame that on human nature. You know, many times people become Christians and then get upset because their troubles haven't gone away. You know, hey, I still owe my credit card $30,000. God didn't make that disappear, or whatever other problems that we might have in life. So Israel wasn't happy. Instead of jumping up for joy and saying, let's go. So we'll get to it as we go on, but in many ways, the plagues that we talk about that were brought upon Egypt, I think they were as much for Israel as they were for Egypt, for Pharaoh. So Israel could see the power of God. And even after seeing what God did with those plagues, they crossed the Red Sea and almost immediately started. In fact, even before they crossed the Red Sea, they see Pharaoh's army coming and says, well, Moses, you just brought us out here to die. You brought us out here to be killed. After seeing all of those plagues, and after crossing the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea, whichever you want to call it, on dry land. Thank you so much for your participation. I appreciate it very much. I've gone a little overtime.